Jacob Miller feels a chill that has nothing to do with the biting wind carving through the pines or the heavy snow that muffles the world in white. It is an old, insidious cold, one that settled deep in his marrow on the day his world fractured. That was the day his mother was gone, and his father's voice, once a source of comfort, became as brittle and sharp as new frost on a window pane. "Men don't break," he had decreed, his face a mask of grim resolve. Those 3 words became the rigid, unforgiving law by which Jacob meticulously constructed his life. Now, hunched by the low fire, he pens another letter to Sarah. The cheap paper crinkles between numb, clumsy fingers as he scratches out promises in ink. He assures her that he remains the same man who left the rolling hills of Ohio, strong, steady, a pillar unshaken by the brutality of war or the desolation of the wilderness. He writes of duty and resolve, words that feel like armor. But the promises are hollow, thin lies whispered against the profound, listening silence of the forest. This is a different kind of quiet from the peace of home. It is an active, predatory silence that presses in from all sides. Each night, as the fire sputters and dies, that crushing stillness echoes the same primal fear his father's stoicism had inadvertently taught him. The stark terror of being utterly alone, of being weighed in the final balance and found wanting. He lives with the constant gnawing dread that the strength he projects is a fragile facade, ready to shatter at any moment. Unseen by the exhausted men around him, his hand slips into his pocket. His fingers find and close around the small, cool, smooth weight of a silver locket. It is his most guarded secret, an anchor to a past he can barely grasp, a clandestine connection to a warmth he struggles to remember. The memory of his mother's smile is a faded photograph in his mind, but the locket is real, a tangible piece of a time before the cold set in. He clutches it, drawing a phantom strength from its presence. His gaze then falls upon a new recruit, huddled nearby, a boy barely old enough to shave, whose hands tremble uncontrollably as he stares into the flickering flames. The boy's fear is a raw, undisguised thing. An impulse, unbidden and unwelcome, moves through Jacob. Without a word, he nudges a piece of his own meager ration of hardtack toward the shaking soldier. It is a small gesture, an act of quiet, anonymous kindness he would vehemently deny if asked. It is a fleeting ghost of the compassionate boy his mother had raised, a boy he thought was long buried and frozen beneath the ice of his father's law. For more stories that pierce the armor we wear, subscribe to the channel. We explore the complexities of the human heart, loss, and the quiet resilience of the spirit. Join us for the next journey. The order came not with a bugle charge or the bark of a sergeant, but with a quiet, insistent tap on my shoulder. It pulled me from the line, from the familiar rhythm of march and wait, and for a glorious, foolish moment, my blood sang with possibility. This was it. A vital mission, a lone foray into enemy territory, a chance to prove I was more than just a name on a roster, more than my father's son. I imagined myself a hero in the making. The reality, delivered by my captain in a low, almost pitying tone, shattered that fantasy into 1,000 pieces. "You're to escort a child to the St. Agnes convent, Jacob." He cleared his throat, refusing to meet my eyes. "She's an orphan, the last of her family." The words landed like stones in my gut. An escort. For a child. All my training in skirmishes, in reconnaissance, in the brutal art of survival, reduced to this. A glorified nursemaid. A wave of hot shame washed over me. I wanted to protest, to argue that my skills were being wasted, but the captain's weary expression silenced me before I could speak. He gestured toward a small figure huddled by the supply wagon. My new charge, Elodie. She was a wisp of a girl, no older than 8, swallowed by a threadbare coat that had likely belonged to her father. She didn't cry or speak, just stared up at me with enormous dark eyes that held the bleak, silent sorrow of a burned-out village. They were old eyes in a young face. In her chapped, grimy hand, she clutched a small wooden bird, its shape almost indistinguishable from years of being held, its surface worn smooth and dark by the constant, anxious caress of her thumb. Looking at her, I felt a familiar, unwelcome pang. This wasn't a mission, it was a test, a deliberate trial of my father's creed, the very one I had fled to this war to escape. "True strength, son," he used to say, "is not in the hand that holds the sword, but in the one that offers shelter." I had scoffed at his words, choosing the cold, hard logic of the army, building a shell around myself so thick that nothing could get in. And now this silent child, this unwanted detour, threatened to hammer at those walls with her quiet grief. Our journey began without a single word exchanged, a shared quiet, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of our boots on the frozen, unforgiving earth. Two strangers, a soldier running from his past and an orphan with no future, walking toward an unknown destination that already felt too much like home. The first night found them sheltered within the hollow of a great fallen log as the wind howled a mournful, lonely tune through the skeletal branches of the forest. Jacob moved with the practiced economy of a soldier, his hands sure and precise as he built a small, smokeless fire to ward off the encroaching chill. He expected the girl, Elodie, to succumb to the day's exhaustion, to curl into a ball and sleep. Yet every time his gaze flickered in her direction, he found her wide, watchful eyes fixed upon him. There was no fear in her stare, only an intense, quiet observation. It was as if she were peeling back his layers, trying to decipher the man beneath the hardened exterior. He broke off a piece of a dry, hard biscuit, the only sustenance they had, and held it out to her. She accepted it with a small, solemn nod, her quiet dignity a strange contrast to her youth and the grime on her face. As she took the offering, her small fingers brushed against his calloused ones. The touch was fleeting, lighter than a breath, but it sent a strange, unexpected jolt through him, a warmth that had no business being there. His gaze, seeking a neutral place to land, was drawn to the object she cradled in her other hand. It was a simple wooden bird, crudely carved, its form rough and unrefined. But the way she held it, with a tenderness that bordered on reverence, suggested it was the most precious treasure on earth. A flicker of curiosity sparked within him, an urge to ask about its origin, its meaning, rising unbidden. He ruthlessly pushed it down. Curiosity was a weakness, a crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed around himself. His armor had to remain intact. The world had shrunk to the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the frozen earth and the grey, unforgiving sky above. Day after day bled into one another, a blur of weary trudging. Then, against the bleak horizon, a thread of smoke unfurled, a delicate curl against the encroaching dusk. It was a sign of life, of warmth, of a hearth. For Jacob and the small, silent girl at his side, the sight of the farmhouse from which it rose was nothing short of a miracle. The door opened to reveal an older couple, their faces weathered but creased into wide smiles. Come in, you poor things, out of the cold." The woman, Mrs. Dubois, ushered them forward with gentle hands. The warmth of the house hit them like a physical blow, a stark contrast to the biting wind they left behind. A fire crackled and roared in a great stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the rich, savory scent of simmering stew. It was an aroma of home, of safety. Jacob watched as Elodie, who had clutched the small wooden bird in her hand for days as if it were her only anchor, slowly let her fingers relax. The tension that had held her small shoulders rigid seemed to melt away in the fire's glow. A wave of gratitude so potent it made his head spin washed over Jacob. He allowed himself, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, to believe in the possibility of rest, to trust in the simple, unasked-for kindness of strangers. Mrs. Dubois fussed over Elodie, clucking softly as she ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl for her. Her husband clapped Jacob soundly on the back, his voice booming with approval. "You're a good man," he said, "looking after the little one." The words, the food, the heat. It was all a balm to his frayed soul. Yet as the evening settled and the initial relief subsided, a subtle disquiet began to prick at the edges of his comfort. He studied their hosts more closely. He noticed the way their smiles, so ready and broad, never quite seemed to touch the depths of their eyes. There was a fixed, glassy quality to their hospitality, a performance that felt just a little too perfect. The warmth of the hearth remained, but the promise it held had begun to feel chillingly hollow. Jacob woke with a start, pulled from a shallow sleep, not by a sound, but by a silent alarm in his gut. A profound sense of wrongness permeated the small, quiet room. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to a bed of sullen embers, its weak light stretching the shadows into long, wavering spectres on the rough-hewn walls. It was in this flickering gloom that he saw them. The Dubois couple, the very people who had offered him and his daughter shelter from the biting wind, were hunched over his pack. Their movements were furtive, guilty. They weren't rummaging for food or the last of his supplies. Their fingers fumbled with the small, hidden inner pocket, the one where he kept his mother's locket. The sight did not ignite the hot flare of rage he might have expected. Instead, a deep, sinking cold seeped into his bones. A chill far more piercing than the night outside. There would be no shouting, no violent struggle. The energy for such things had been leached from him long ago. He simply rose from his pallet on the floor, the soft rustle of his blanket loud in the tense silence. Their heads snapped up, and in the dim, unsteady light their eyes met his. Jacob saw no malice in their faces, no cruel intent. What he saw was far more unsettling, a desperate, hollow hunger that had eaten away at their humanity, a raw shame that couldn't quite mask their need. Wordlessly, he began to gather his meager belongings. He moved with a quiet deliberation, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He gently lifted a sleeping Elodie into his arms, her small body warm and trusting against him. She murmured softly, but did not wake. He wrapped her more tightly in her blanket and, with one last look at the thieves who stared back at him with a mixture of fear and despair, he slipped out the door. The freezing night air hit him like a physical blow, but the betrayal stung more sharply. It was a stark reminder that the most painful losses have nothing to do with what can be held in one's hand, but with the trust that once broken can never be recovered. The warmth of the house they had left behind was now a distant, cruel memory, a phantom comfort that mocked them with every weary step. They walked until the blackness of night began to yield to the grey promise of dawn, their bodies aching with a cold that had settled deep in their bones. Ahead, another farm emerged from the gloom, its silhouette stark and unwelcoming against the lightening sky. This place felt harder, its lines more severe, lacking any of the gentle domesticity of their last refuge. As they approached, the sound of a barn door groaning open cut through the morning stillness. A man appeared, his figure framed in the dark opening. One of his sleeves was empty, neatly pinned to the side of his coarse jacket. His face, etched with lines of hardship, was a mask of suspicion as he watched them draw near. "What do you want?" he grunted, the words sharp and hostile. His gaze swept over Jacob's tattered uniform, and his expression hardened with an open, undisguised contempt. This was Jean-Luc. Jacob, supporting a near-slumbering Elodie, began to explain their desperate situation, his voice raspy with fatigue. The farmer, however, cut him off with a scoff. "Another soldier," he sneered, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Playing the hero after your wars trample the fields of men like me." His words were a physical blow, dismissing Jacob's entire existence. He gestured dismissively down the road. "Move on! We have no room for your kind here." A familiar fire ignited in Jacob's gut, the old defensive anger, the primal need to defend his purpose, his duty, the sacrifices he had made. The words to retort, sharp and proud, rose in his throat, But then he looked down at Elodie. Her small face was pale with exhaustion, her head lolling against his arm, completely spent. The sight extinguished his anger, replacing it with a profound ache. He swallowed his pride, the act feeling like swallowing stones. "Please," he said, the word emerging rough and foreign from his mouth. He looked from the farmer's hardened face back to the child. "Just for the girl, a place out of the wind." A sigh, heavy with the weight of unwelcome obligation, escaped Jean-Luc as he gestured curtly toward the barn. The movement was one of profound irritation, a dismissal that offered shelter, but no warmth. For Jacob and his companion, it was at least a roof over their heads. They trudged from the damp evening chill into the cavernous, draughty space, their exhaustion a physical weight on their shoulders. The air inside was thick, a complex mixture of the earthy, sweet scent of hay, the dampness of the soil floor, and the sharper animal tang of livestock shifting restlessly in their stalls. Dust motes danced like tiny sprites in the final, fading shafts of light that filtered through the cracks in the weathered wooden walls. It was a refuge of the most basic kind, a place not of welcome, but of weary, resentful tolerance. They settled into a pile of straw, the cold seeping through their damp uniforms. Hours passed. The sky outside deepened from bruised purple to an inky, starless black, and the sounds of the night, the rustle of unseen creatures, the distant sigh of the wind, magnified the feeling of isolation. Just as a gnawing hunger began to truly torment them, the silhouette of the farmer appeared in the doorway, framed against the darkness. He carried a simple wooden bowl of soup, its thin, steamy vapor barely visible in the gloom, accompanied by a hunk of dark, coarse bread. He set it down on an overturned crate between them, the thud of the crockery echoing his resolute silence. He did not leave. Instead, he stood back, arms crossed over his chest, a sentinel of sorrow, watching them eat with an unnerving intensity. The silence stretched thick and heavy, punctuated only by the scrape of their spoons. "You think that uniform makes you important," Jean-Luc said suddenly, his voice a low rasp, laced with a bitterness so deep it seemed to have been carved into him by generations of hardship. He stared directly at Jacob, his eyes holding no deference for the soldier's attire, only a raw, assessing contempt. "You follow your orders. You convince yourselves you are serving some great and noble cause, but the cause is a phantom for men like us. It goes home to warm beds and victory parades when the fighting is done, and what's left behind in the mud and the fields." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. "Men like you and men like me, just the broken pieces." Jacob's mouth opened, ready to counter with the well-rehearsed words of honor, duty, and the promises made to their nation. The rhetoric felt instinctive, a shield he had carried for months. But the arguments died on his lips, feeling hollow and shamefully naive, like paper defenses against the farmer's raw, weathered pain. The man before him was not a concept to be debated. He was the living consequence of causes and conflicts, a figure of stoic endurance etched with loss. In his hardened gaze, Jacob saw a truth more potent than any speech from a general. For the first time, the crisp fabric of his uniform felt less like armor and more like a fragile costume. He looked down at his own hands, then back at the farmer, and a terrifying question took root in the sudden, barren landscape of his certainty. When this was all over, when the uniform finally came off, what would he be then? Quelques jours plus tard, ils trouvèrent refuge pour la nuit dans la carcasse d'une église. Le toit avait depuis longtemps cédé la place au ciel, mais les murs de pierre offraient un répit contre le vent qui balayait le paysage. Alors que Jacob tentait de trouver le sommeil, son corps endolori étendu sur le sol froid, il perçut un son. Ce n'était pas le gémissement du vent dans les arches béantes, mais une voix, infime et chuchotante. C'était Elodie. Tournant le dos, elle s'adressait à son oiseau de bois, son unique confident. Il ne parvenait pas à saisir tous les mots, une litanie enfantine murmurée dans le secret. Mais l'un d'eux se détacha du souffle indistinct, flottant avec une clarté glaciale dans l'air sacré de la ruine. Le traître. Le mot resta en suspens dans l'espace qui les séparait, aussi tranchant qu'un éclat de verre. Il alluma quelque chose en Jacob, une sensation familière, la brûlure d'une injustice sans nom. L'image de son père lui revint, non pas son visage, mais son silence. Un silence lourd qui avait toujours pesé comme un jugement, une condamnation muette. Un instant, son propre sentiment de trahison, enfoui et solitaire, fusionna avec l'accusation murmurée de la petite fille. Il la regarda, petite silhouette fragile, confiance à peine à un jouet, et comprit que le poids de ce mot, il le partageait désormais dans le silence de la nuit. The word trailed them like a persistent ghost, clinging to the dust kicked up by their weary feet. Traitor. It was the only sound that seemed to escape Elodie's lips for days, a single, hollow echo of a story she kept locked away. Jacob watched her more closely now, this quiet girl with old eyes, and felt the accusation hang in the air between them. He turned the word over in his mind, trying to imagine the face of the person who could have inflicted a wound so deep as to earn such a name from a child. Thirst gnawed at them, forcing their path towards the familiar silhouette of Jean-Luc's farm, a reluctant sanctuary. They had stopped there before for water, an encounter marked by the farmer's curt dismissal and resentful gaze. As they drew near, they saw him by the fence line, his broad back a testament to a life of hard labor, his attention wholly consumed by a repair. Leaving Elodie in the meager shade of a wilting tree, Jacob approached cautiously. Jean-Luc was mending a splintered fence post, and the sight held Jacob captive. The farmer's left arm was gone below the elbow, but his right hand worked with an astonishing grace that belied the man's abrasive nature. It was a powerful, calloused hand, yet it moved with the delicate precision of a surgeon. He held a small, worn carving knife, its blade an extension of his fingers, as he shaved thin, fragrant curls of wood from a new piece. His movements were patient, fluid, and profoundly gentle, a stark contrast to the harsh, clipped words he had thrown at them before. He was not just fixing the fence, he was restoring it, his touch both firm and nurturing as he shaped the new wood to seamlessly join the old. Jacob stood frozen, a realization dawning on him. This was the hand of a creator, of a carver who understood the soul of the wood he worked. It was not the hand of a destroyer, of a man defined solely by bitterness and loss. The image clashed violently with the version of Jean-Luc he had constructed in his mind. This small, intricate detail, the quiet artistry in a farmer's hand, was a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that didn't fit. It whispered of a different story, a depth and a past that Jacob was only just beginning to suspect. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, cutting through the barn's old timbers. While helping Jean-Luc clear a space, Jacob's elbow caught the edge of an old wooden crate, balanced precariously on a stack of hay bales. It toppled with a hollow thud, spilling its contents onto the dusty floor. A few small objects rolled out from the debris. Jacob knelt, his eyes drawn to a familiar shape among the scattered carving tools. He picked it up. It was a small, half-finished wooden bird, its wings still rough and unsanded. The form was unmistakable, almost identical to the little treasure Elodie clutched so tightly. He turned the object over in his palm, the wood smooth against his skin, and looked up at Jean-Luc. The question hung unspoken in the heavy air between them. The farmer's gruff facade, a wall Jacob had come to know well, finally seemed to crumble. Jean-Luc's shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, weary sigh, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the barn. He gestured towards the small bird in Jacob's hand. "I used to carve them," he said, his voice softer than Jacob had ever heard it. "For my daughter." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "She was about this one's age," he added, a slight nod in the direction of the house where Elodie was. "I sent her away, to her aunt's in the south, when things started to get bad." The words were heavy, with a pain that felt ancient. "I don't know if she's safe. I don't know anything." He explained how he had found Elodie wandering alone on the road, a small, lost figure in a world that had fallen apart. He had nothing to give her but a memory, one of his daughter's finished birds, the only comfort he had to offer a child who mirrored his own lost girl. In that instant, the tension between the two men dissolved. Jacob no longer saw an antagonist, a wary host he had to appease. He saw a man drowning in the same sea of fear he was, haunted by the spectre of loss and the crushing weight of helplessness. Jean-Luc was a mirror, reflecting Jacob's own deepest anxieties. The half-finished bird in his hand was no longer just a piece of wood, but a symbol of a shared, unbearable grief. The farmhouse, with its lingering scent of wood smoke and quiet sorrow, receded behind them until it was just a smudge against the rolling green hills. As Jacob and Elodie walked away from Jean-Luc's land for the last time, the silence that enveloped them was a different creature entirely. Gone was the taut, brittle quiet of the journey's early days, a silence born of mutual strangeness and the chasm between a weary soldier and a frightened child. This new silence was soft and breathable, a shared space that asked for nothing. It was companionable, punctuated only by the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the gravel road and the distant melodic call of a bird echoing their own newfound peace. Jacob glanced down at the small carved songbird Elodie clutched in her hand, its wooden form worn smooth by her constant touch. He understood its significance now, with a clarity that settled deep in his bones. It was far more than a simple toy, more than a diversion for a lonely child. He could almost see the ghost of Jean-Luc's hands working the wood, channeling a father's immeasurable loss into a tangible object of beauty. The bird was a legacy, a silent message of solidarity passed from one grieving man to the daughter of another, a talisman against the encroaching shadows of a world torn apart. It was a link in a chain of shared human sorrow, a story told without words. His perception of the girl beside him had undergone a similar profound shift. She was no longer a mission, a fragile package to be guarded and delivered to a predetermined point on a map. She was Elodie, a person, whole and complex, whose small, warm hand would sometimes find its way into his own, a trusting gesture that grounded him more than any military order ever had. He found himself noticing the little things, the way a stray strand of her hair caught the sunlight like spun gold, the determined rhythm of her small steps matching his own stride for stride. In her quiet resilience, he saw a strength he had long forgotten. In the quiet chambers of his mind, the half-written letters to his wife, Sarah, faded into nothing. For weeks, they had been his anchor, a ritual of reassurance where he promised to return unchanged, to come home as the same man she had kissed goodbye. He knew now that those promises were a lie he could no longer tell, not even to himself. The man who left her was gone, chipped away by the horrors he had witnessed and reshaped by the unexpected gravity of this small child's trust. The man who walked this road was someone new, someone who understood that some wounds never truly heal, but are simply carried differently. This certainty was a living thing inside him, at once frightening in its finality and liberating in its truth. He was already changed, and there was no going back. The convent was so close, he could almost feel its peace. On the wind, a faint imagined tolling of bells whispered of sanctuary just ahead. But the world had other plans. A deep, guttural rumble began, a sound that came not from some distant battle, but from the very bones of the earth beneath their feet. It was the groaning protest of the thawing mountain shrugging off its winter mantle in a catastrophic torrent of rock and snow. The ground shuddered violently, and ancient pines snapped like kindling, crashing down around them in a deafening symphony of splintering wood. In the heart of the swirling chaos, Elodie's hand was ripped from Jacob's grasp. He screamed her name, a desperate, useless sound that was instantly devoured by the roar of the collapsing world. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise ceased. An eerie, profound stillness descended upon the newly scarred landscape, the air thick with the dust of pulverized rock and the sharp scent of pine, and she was gone. Primal fear clawed at his chest as he scrambled over the treacherous debris, a slick morass of mud, snow, and stone. He called her name until his throat was raw, the sound echoing without reply in the suffocating silence. His frantic search yielded only one thing. There, half buried in the cold mud, lay the little wooden bird he had carved for her. It was snapped cleanly in two. In that broken object, he saw his own ruin, the promise to his commander to deliver her safely, broken. The unspoken vow to Jean-Luc to protect his sister, broken. And the promise made long ago to his father, to never break, that one did not merely crack. It shattered into a million irreparable pieces, leaving him utterly alone in the quiet devastation. In the profound silence that settles over the ruin of the landscape, Jacob surrenders. He sits amongst the debris, a ghost in a graveyard of memories, and finally lets the cold inside win, a glacial numbness creeping through his veins until it reaches his heart. In one hand, he clutches the two splintered pieces of the wooden bird, its painted wings now fractured and mute. In the other, he holds the cool, familiar weight of his mother's locket. And then he weeps. Great, shuddering sobs rack his body, tears carving hot tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He weeps for the lost girl whose laughter once filled these spaces, for the lonely farmer who tended this land with calloused, hopeful hands, and for a little boy, far away in a small Ohio town, who was taught that his tears were a shameful weakness, a flaw to be beaten out of him. But in the raw, agonizing honesty of that breaking, something new and resilient is forged. The dam of his grief bursts, and in the flood, old certainties are washed away. He sees his father, not as the unyielding tyrant of his childhood, but as another lonely, frightened boy, trapped inside a man's body, repeating the only lessons he ever learned. The harsh words, the rigid expectations, they were not signs of strength, but the rattling armor of a terrified soul. Jacob understands then that true strength isn't about being unbreakable, a flawless monolith against the storms of life. It is the quiet, courageous act of putting the pieces back together, with fingers that tremble not from cold, but from revelation. He opens the locket. It clicks softly, revealing the faded photograph within, a ghost of his mother's smile. He ignores it, focusing instead on the delicate silver chain. Carefully, patiently, he unfastens the clasp and wraps the chain around the two halves of the wooden bird, binding the splintered wood together. The repair is clumsy, the silver a stark contrast to the painted pine, but it holds. The bird is whole again, scarred but complete. In that moment, his new mission becomes clear, a path forward, born not from a sense of grim duty, but from the fierce, mending power of love. He materializes in the convent courtyard more like a phantom than a man, his frame stooped under the weight of the tragic news he has come to deliver. He expects only solemnity and sorrow, a final confirmation of loss. And then, through the haze of his grief, he sees her, Elodie. She is perched on a stone bench, swaddled in a thick wool blanket, her presence a quiet, impossible miracle. The nuns, it turns out, had found her wandering the hillsides in the dazed aftermath of the rockslide. A wave of relief, so potent and complete, it feels like a physical unburdening, like grace itself, washes through him. He crosses the flagstones, the sound of his own footsteps returning to him, and kneels before her. From his pocket, he retrieves the small wooden bird, its form now whole again, and offers it. Her small fingers accept the gift, tracing the delicate silver chain that now binds the once broken pieces, a testament to repair and a promise kept. Later, in the quiet presence of the Mother Superior, Jacob gives voice to the final shadow haunting him. Elodie spoke of a traitor, he murmurs, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. The elderly nun's face, etched with a life of empathy, softens further. There was no traitor, my son, she explains gently. Her father was a man of immense courage. To save his family, he created a diversion, a desperate, selfless act to draw the attention of those who hunted them. She lets the silence hold the weight of her words before continuing. The other villagers, consumed by their own terror, saw only a man running towards the danger they fled. In their panic, they mistook his heroism for betrayal. He was lost in the very confusion he engineered for their survival. In the sanctuary's stillness, the truth lands not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap of clarity. The last of Jacob's anger dissolves, washed away by a profound understanding that surges beyond the present moment, reaching back to recast the painful, shadowed history of his own past and of his own father. A sudden commotion shatters the courtyard's fragile peace as local authorities herd in a group of men and boys. Their mismatched uniforms tell a story of disarray. They are not prisoners of war, but displaced people from the other side. Their faces etched with exhaustion and terror. The air crackles with the villagers' resentment and fear. "They don't belong here!" A voice cuts through the silence. Jacob feels the old, familiar pull of that anger, the instinct to choose a side that has guided him for so long. But his gaze falls upon Elodie, who watches the newcomers not with animosity, but with a child's solemn curiosity. In her hand, she clutches the mended bird, a potent symbol of a sacrifice he had so badly misunderstood. The sight shifts something deep within him. Turning his back on the angry crowd, he walks to the water barrel. The scrape of the metal cup is a grounding sound in the chaos. He fills it and approaches the frightened boys, kneeling to offer it to one who can't be much older than he was when his mother passed. The act is simple, quiet, and in its profound humanity, Jacob is finally free. The war he had been fighting his whole life, the one inside his own heart, is over. The scene shifts to Ohio, to the quiet of his father's house, a silence no longer empty, but full of a peace he earned one difficult step at a time. On the table beside him rests a letter from France, and with it a child's drawing of a bird, finally at rest.